The captain, first officer, two flight attendants, and 64 passengers received fatal injuries. It's such a sterile postscript. The NTSB standard for removing emotion from the context of the investigation. You can't blame them. If they told you the truth, you wouldn't see beyond the horror.
Sink rate.
They gathered all the remains they could find of that ATR-72 in the soybean field a stone's throw from Chicago. The family members of the victims gathered out there not long after to mourn their loved ones. Wandering over the fallow ground, they stumbled on decaying body parts. The cleanup effort hadn't been as comprehensive as regulators had thought. The NTSB apologized, and then they blamed the French. The crash happened on Halloween, which would be a good start to a B-movie if it was fiction. Simmons Airlines was the operator of the 72-seat turboprop ATR. They were doing business as American Eagle Flight 4184 with scheduled service between Indianapolis and Chicago. It was the second leg of the day for the flight crew. The first officer was flying. After pushing back, they were forced to wait 42 minutes on the ground due to traffic flow into O'Hare. En route were unremarkable late October reports of rime ice in the northern skies. It was an up-and-down flight. Climb to 16,000 feet, descent clearance into Chicago before you've leveled off. The crew descended to 10,000 feet where they were instructed to expect holding instructions due to a wind shift and change of landing runways at O'Hare. A minute later, Flight 4184 reported entering the holds. The flight data recorder depicted an airspeed of 175 knots. 9 minutes later, the captain said, "Man, this thing gets a high deck angle on these turns. We're just wallowing in the air right now." FTR data indicated that the angle of attack was 5 degrees, fairly normal for a jet at 36,000 feet, but a recline for a puddle-hopping turboprop. The first officer responded, "You want flaps 15?" Captain came back, "I'll be ready for the stall procedure here pretty soon. Kick 'em in, bring the nose down." Another 8 minutes passed, and the single-engine chime of the caution alert could be heard over the cockpit voice recorder. Likely this was due to ice accumulation, because right after this, the flight data recorder depicted activation of the airframe de-icing system. The ATR-72, like nearly all turboprops in the 1990s, defended itself against ice accumulation through a multitude of devices. Heated elements prevented formation on the pitot probes, which provided airspeed data to the crew. The windshields were similarly heated to retain outside visibility. Both of these heating systems would have been on regardless of icing conditions while in flight. The aircraft also had a motley assortment of vulcanized rubber stretched along the wings, tail, and engine intake. Pressurized air from the compressor section of the engines could be fed into the design cavities in the boots, which caused the rubber to expand. The idea was that any ice which had accumulated on the surface of the leading edges would shatter and be blown off the airframe. In practice, it would clear about 80% of the surfaces. Imperfect, but it got the job done as long as the rate of ice accumulation wasn't too severe. Since the boots don't do anything useful without any ice on them, aircraft policy is to wait for accumulation before activating the system. The first officer, with both an impressive response delay and striking synchronization, said, "That's much nicer, flaps 15 minutes after they had been selected." It was immediately followed up with, "I'm showing some ice now." The captain soon after circled back around to the status of the flaps. "I'm sure that once they let us out of the hold, we'll forget they're down and get an overspeed." Nothing good happens to a prophet on Halloween. A minute later, the crew was instructed to descend to 8,000 feet. In the descent, airspeed increased to 186 knots, followed by the sound of the flap overspeed warning. The captain commented, "I knew we'd do that." The first officer responded, "I was trying to keep it at 180. Someone retracted the flaps, and the angle of attack increased to 5 degrees as the aircraft descended through 9,100 feet. Within a half a second, the aileron snapped into full right wing down. It shouldn't have done this. The autopilot was on and immediately attempted to fight the control force. It automatically disconnected once its force threshold was exceeded. The aircraft rapidly rolled to the right, and the aircraft nose pointed sharply down. The flight deck resounded with expletives and heavy breathing. They got the roll stopped at 77 degrees. The aircraft began rolling left back towards wings level with the low angle of attack, but the nose pointed down 15 degrees. This apparently got the attention of the pilot flying, who increased back pressure to bring the nose to the horizon. The angle of attack on the wings increased as the aircraft continued to recover through 59 degrees of bank. Once the angle of attack exceeded 5 degrees in the descent, the ailerons once again snapped to the right. A force sensor on the captain's control column recorded 22 pounds of nose-up force, the maximum value that it could depict. The resultant rolling rate to the right exceeded 50 degrees per second, putting the transport category aircraft into the realm reserved for fighter jocks. If they had had 100 hours to think about it, the crew would probably have never guessed the cause of the roll excursion was the rippled ice that had accumulated upwind of the ailerons. When the angle of attack of the wing, not to be mistaken with the pitch angle of the aircraft, exceeded 5 degrees, the oddly shaped ice produced a dramatic aerodynamic effect. At 180 knots, the wind has a right hook the intensity of a young Mike Tyson. It clobbered the left aileron down, which through the control cables clobbered the right aileron up, which ultimately resulted in an inverted flight with 64 screaming passengers. The 29-year-old captain released nose-up control pressure as the aircraft rotated upside down, which was a correct response, but his 30-year-old first officer, perhaps due to the negative G-forces of being upside down, yanked back hard on the yoke. After this, there was no recovery. The NTSB calculated that 56 pounds of rolling force on the yoke would have likely been enough to arrest the aggressive, uncommanded deflection of the ailerons. This would have been well within the physical capabilities of two strapping young men, but they didn't blame them. Pilots rarely exert over a few pounds of force on the flight controls. The excursions were so wildly unexpected, and the force and the response time infinitesimally small, that they really had no hope of regaining control in the short bit of time they had between realizing something had horribly gone wrong and impacting that dreary field in Newton County, Indiana. The FAA would go on to prohibit the ATR fleet from flight into known icing conditions for a few weeks because of the investigation. American Eagle would eventually ban all of their ATRs to island hopping out of Puerto Rico. ATR, in combination with the NTSB and NASA, would develop and test enhanced de-ice boots that extended further aft along the edge of the wing. The NTSB would blame French regulatory authorities for lax oversight in the development of the French-based ATR fleet. Not wanting to be accused of being anti-Franco, they'd cast some shade on the FAA too. Among other things, better unusual attitude training would gradually infiltrate pilot training programs, along with continued emphasis on the dangers of flight in icing conditions. That last bit has never quite been solved. History repeats itself imperfectly. In the waning days of this past summer, 2024 for future viewers, Voepass Flight 2283 dramatically spun into the ground in Vinhedo, São Paulo. August in Brazil isn't the time that you'd expect an airplane to crash due to ice accumulation, but everything's cold at 17,000 feet. For all the improvements that ATR developed to restore the fleet's image in the cold, it wasn't enough to overcome the Voepass crew's blasé response when they received an early indication of de-ice boot failure during the climb-out. The abnormal checklist associated with the failure indication dictated that the aircraft should exit and avoid ice. It's unclear if the crew ever accomplished the required abnormal procedure. They did turn off the faulty de-ice system as instructed in the checklist, but they neither discussed nor altered their flight path on the 5 occasions that ice detectors alerted airframe ice accumulation following the failure message. As they arrived at their top of descent to the destination, the ice accumulation apparently became significant. The crew began commenting on it. They turned on the faulty system, diverging from the instructions in the abnormal failure procedure. They turned it off again once the failure messages returned. The ice accumulation must have been severe. Not long after, they attempted once again to turn the system on. They received 3 different alerts of increasing intensity that indicated that not only was ice accumulating on the aircraft, but that the resultant drag was slowing the big turboprop to an unacceptably slow speed. While in a turn towards the destination airport, the aircraft first stalled and then spun. Horrified witnesses on the ground first heard the signs of distress and then captured the final moments of the aircraft after it descended through the clouds and crashed into the yard of a well-heeled house in a gated community. The airplane had been booked to capacity, but only 62 passengers wound up perishing in the crash of the 72-seater. 10 lucky souls first cursed their fortunes when they missed a flight due to confusion over the departure gate, then prayed to the rosary once they realized that the error had saved their lives. God bless them all. Stay safe.